So first of all, I need to apologize that my talk today will be quite sporadic because fitting about 1,200 years of history and contemporary aspects of the Holy Mountain to such a short lecture is quite difficult. But I will present to you both basic facts about the Holy Mountain and its history, and also some reflections on how it's manifested today. Mount Athos, which you see, now you see here with the green part, you see the peninsula called Chalkidiki in northern Greece. You see the three fingers, and the Holy Mountain, Mount Athos, is the easternmost of those fingers. They're called also legs in Greek, depends on the language how you call them. In Finnish we call them fingers. It's a peninsula which is 50 kilometers long and about 7 to 12 kilometers wide, located in northeastern Greece, and forms a part of the greater peninsula called Chalkidiki, as I said. Here's a more detailed map of the Athenite Peninsula. Nowadays it is an autonomous republic that belongs to the Hellenic democracy. The history of its autonomous status is 1,000 years old, at least. The peninsula is a unique place in many ways. It has been inhabited by almost exclusively monastics for at least 1,200 years, and the seclusion of this area has led to it having a very rich flora. The monasteries, the oldest one of which date from the 10th century, are counted as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But today I will speak of the spiritual heritage of the Holy Mountain more than the material heritage, and how it has affected the rest of the Orthodox world up until our days. And in conjunction with this, I shall present to you a rough overview of the history of the Holy Mountain, in case you don't know it. So, the name of the peninsula, Athos, we call it Mount Athos, derives from the mountain in the southern end of the peninsula that was, according to Greek mythology, thrown at the god of sea, Poseidon, during the so-called Gigantomachia, the fight of the giants, by one of the Gigantes, the giants, Athos. The mountain is referred to in the Iliad by Homer, and it keeps coming up in the Greek antiquity elsewhere too. In late antiquity, the peninsula was inhabited by lay communities. There are historical sources and also archaeological evidence that there were churches on the peninsula that were destroyed during the reign of Julian the Apostate in the 360s. And a couple of decades later, the pagan temples of the peninsula were destroyed during the reign of Theodosius I. Even today we still have some archaeological objects that refer to pagan cults on this peninsula. Some later legends have suggested that the earliest monasteries would have been founded during the reign of Constantine the Great, but there is no actual support for these claims, either in historiography or in archaeological evidence. Many of these stories about the glorious past of the Holy Mountain, that reached, according to these stories, to the 4th century, came to circulate during the Ottoman rule from the 15th century onwards. A Greek scholar has noted that it was the difficult political situation that called for slightly exaggerating stories about the glorious past of the place. The first Athenite ascetic known by name is Saint Peter the Athenite, who lived there in the 9th century, probably. But he was not the first ascetic to have lived on the peninsula. We know that assumedly monks saw the eruption of the Thira volcano in 726 from Mount Athos, and some monks have been said to have participated in the 7th Ecumenical Council in 787. Moreover, Peter's life, or the biographical text that we have of his life, describes how the peninsula already had a significant amount of ascetics living there when he arrived. The first actual monasteries were built in the late 9th century, but none of them has survived up until our days. It is also during this time when the autonomous status of the peninsula was laid. Emperor Basil I issued a decree in 885 that the Holy Mountain should be reserved for monks only, and no laymen were allowed to reside there. At the same time, in the late 9th century there was already a council of Athenite elders, indicating a self-governing administrative structure of the peninsula. Some have suggested that many of the monks of the Holy Mountain in the 8th and 9th centuries would have been refugees from the restlessness of the iconoclast controversy, but there is not much historical evidence to support this theory. Despite the prominence of monastic tradition in the Holy Mountain since at least the 8th century, the earliest monasteries that have been preserved up until our days were built in the 10th century. This also includes my own monastery, founded by Saint Xenophon before or in 998. The most important in historical significance of the Athonite monasteries is the Great Lavra, which was founded in 963 by Saint Athanasius the Athonite. Even today, the Great Lavra holds the greatest part of the Athonite grounds, because the peninsula is divided between the 20 monasteries, and has the first place in the hierarchy between the monasteries, even though it is perhaps not the most dynamic monastic community today. Gradually, the hierarchy was established to 20 monasteries, the number of which, according to the Athonite constitution, cannot change. So there will always be 20 monasteries, unless the constitution will be changed. All new dwellings, kits or huts or hermitages that exist on the Holy Mountain must belong to one of the monasteries in an administrative way. The Council of the Elders that I referred to, that has existed since the 9th century, is called Holy Community, and it consists of representatives from each of the monasteries, so there are 20 members in the monastery, in the community. And sometimes if there are serious issues to be discussed, there's a so-called double meeting, which includes all the representatives and the abbots of the monasteries. So there are 40 people. Every year, 4 representatives take up a governing task and form the so-called epistasia, which is a kind of government of the Holy Mountain. The leader of this tetrarchy is called Protos, the first monk of the Holy Mountain. So one could say that the Holy Mountain has a fairly well-functioning democratic system, even though there are no elections. There's just these representatives from each monastery appointed by the abbot. Some of you might be familiar with the epithet of the Holy Mountain, the Garden of the Theotokos, in Greek Περιβόληδης Παναγίας, that has been used for the Holy Mountain for some time. In the life of St. Peter the Athonite, the Theotokos, Virgin Mary, appears to St. Peter and promises to protect the ascetics of the peninsula. In some later sources, there is a famous legend of the Theotokos and St. John the Theologian ending up, as a result of a storm, to the shores of the Athonite peninsula. According to the story, Mary is attracted by the beautiful nature of this place, and Christ's voice from the heaven grants it to her as her garden, and thus the place is called the Garden of the Theotokos. The first historical sources for this story are quite late, from the 16th century, but that of course does not outrule a possible older oral transmission of this tradition. Whatever the case is, already the life of St. Peter shows that the peninsula was, at least from the 9th century onwards, identified with the person of the Theotokos. Many of the old monasteries and churches were accordingly dedicated to her name, including the Protaton Church, which is the central church of the central government, and the Vatopedi Monastery, which is one of the oldest monasteries, if actually not older than the Lavra, according to some archaeologists, which was dedicated to the Annunciation. Mary's role in the Holy Mountain has also sometimes been seen as a reason for the principle of avaton, or the ban of women from the Holy Mountain, that has been preserved up until our days. So the monasteries are forbidden grounds for women, and actually even the entry of men is restricted nowadays through a special visa system that we have. It was a basic principle in the early monastic tradition not to allow the opposite sex or young boys to enter the monastery grounds in order to prevent possible moral problems, but also to cultivate a silence. Nowadays this principle is not followed in most Orthodox monasteries, but there are many other examples of the avaton apart from the Holy Mountain too. But however, because the Holy Mountain has its own legislation and its own constitution, the entrance of women to the monastery has been legally sanctioned. After the rise of the feminist movement in the latter half of the 20th century, this principle has been criticized quite much. It has been a particularly disputed matter since Greece joined the European Union, and the European Parliament has given complaints to Greece since the avaton, according to them, violates the principle of free mobility inside the European Union. This has, however, not resulted to any changes in the legal status of the matter. The reason behind the avaton, the ban of women, is not misogynism, but realism. The Orthodox spiritual tradition recognizes the dangers that lay in the encounter between the sexes and the work of the devil in such encounters. So the Avaton is there to prevent such events. However, at the same time, the Holy Mountain, both now and in the past, sees its task as a lighthouse of Orthodox spirituality and takes care of the spiritual needs of women as well. But this task, in other words, leaving the peninsula in order to encounter women, so the monks have to leave from there to see women, is given only to monks that are known for their adequate spiritual maturity to resist temptations. Many Hiero monks leave the mountain weekly to receive confessions from men and women alike, and in the 20th century, several female monasteries have been founded to provide an image of Athonite monasticism outside of the Holy Mountain, so that the women can also see this. Often one hears the claim also that the Holy Mountain hides its treasures from the eyes of the world. Indeed, many of the monasteries enjoyed sponsorship from Byzantine emperors, but also especially from Serbian rulers. Later, during the Ottoman rule, it was the Moldo-Wallachians who financially supported the monasteries. And therefore, the monasteries are, apart from being spiritual centers, also full of treasures. There are tens of thousands of valuable Byzantine manuscripts, and not only in Greek, but also in Arabic, Slavonic, and Romanian, to mention a few languages. There are some significant icons and also mural paintings, perhaps most famous example of them being the frescoes painted by Manuel Panselinos, the master of the Macedonian school active in the 14th century, which are located in the Protaton Church of the Holy Community. There are, of course, many other silver artifacts, pieces of wood carving, and architectural miracles throughout the peninsula as well. But we would answer that the Holy Mountain does not hide these treasures. It has actually preserved many of them in a much better way than monasteries outside of the Holy Mountain managed to do under the Muslim rule. In the recent years, there has been a lot of major exhibitions in cities like Thessaloniki or Helsinki in Finland, where actually, to my knowledge, the biggest exhibition ever on the Holy Mountain was organized, with extensive collections of Athonite treasures. Another important contribution to Orthodox theology and scholarship in general is the digitization of manuscripts that are hidden in Athonite libraries. As I said, the Holy Mountain holds one of the most impressive collections of Byzantine manuscripts in the world, and in the past it was naturally only men who could access them directly. But in the past decade, a big part of the manuscript material has been digitized either by the monastery's own initiative or with an EU project, European Union project, which started from our monastery actually last year. The high-quality digitized manuscripts can now be used by scholars all over the world, men and women alike, and the digitization also protects the manuscripts against fires, a plague that has destroyed significant numbers of the manuscripts even in the 21st century, as we saw in the Serbian monastery Hilandar. But now a jump back to history. I said this is sporadic, so I'm sorry. A particularly important part of Athonite history is the 14th century when we think about Athonite spirituality. Then a monk called Gregory, Palamas by his last name, was living an ascetic life in several monasteries and sketes of the peninsula. Because of the threat of Turkish invasion, he moved to Thessaloniki and became a priest and later on a bishop there. He defended the so-called hesychasts, a word deriving from the Greek word ησυχία, that denotes silence, against a monk called Varlan. It is traditionally said that Varlan represented Western scholastic thought, even though he was an Orthodox, while St. Gregory represented the hesychastic mystical stream of Eastern Christianity. Gregory won the controversy in 6 synods organized in Constantinople in the mid-14th century. It is important to remember that the hesychastic thought of Gregory Palamas has influenced Eastern Christianity fundamentally and remains to be a matter of dispute both between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches, but also among Orthodox theologians today. A recent example of the controversiality of Palamas' thought in academic theology is a recent book by Archimandrite Panteleimon Manoussakis, where he deals in a chapter with Palamas' theology and its reconciliation with the West. And he kind of tries to reconcile between Palamas and the Western Augustinian thought, but according to my judgment, fails to do so convincingly. Also, the recent books edited by some Fordham scholars on the Orthodox readings of Augustine and Aquinas touch on this issue and the Palamite question. with again some criticism from other scholars, including me, something, but I cannot discuss this very much now. It would be a topic of another talk, maybe next year. So the controversy of Gregory Palamas was fundamentally on how God can be known. And it's important to note that Gregory learned his mystical life or mystical spirituality in the Holy Mountain. Gregory crystallized the so-called essence-energies distinction. This is quite advanced theology, so I'm sorry if somebody can't follow. This is a stream of thought apparent already in fathers before him, especially in the theology of Saint Maximus the Confessor, who lived in the 7th century. So, according to Gregory, the essence of God is inapproachable and it cannot be known by men. But we can experience God through his uncreated energies, which would actually translate better as activities into English. Some English speakers prefer activity. On the contrary, this Western or Calabrian Greek monk, Varlam, claimed that God is fundamentally unknowable and undemonstrable to men. This theological debate might sound dogmatic and distant from everyday reality, but Palamas also found support for his teachings from the superiors of the Holy Mountain in a synod organized in 1340 and 41. The council resulted in a tone where Athonite mysticism is crystallized. For the hesychasts who practiced a quiet prayer life, the energies of God or the activities of God were not a theoretical concept resulting from a merely logical thinking. Instead, for the sanctified hesychasts, the energies of God appeared during the time of prayer as the so-called uncreated light. Uncreated light is the light that the person sees usually during prayer. We must remember that according to the teachings of Gregory, the uncreated light does not mean that God transforms himself to a form that is sensible for us through our normal senses. The uncreated light is not something, or it's not something, it's not a thing. Rather, the uncreated light, or seeing the uncreated light, is a result of an activity of the Holy Spirit that transforms our senses. It doesn't change God in any way, it changes us. The change happens in us, not in God, who is inapproachable. And this is what Varlam did not understand when he accused the hesychasts for polytheism, since there would have been a visible and an invisible God, according to Varlam's logic. But anyway, Palamas' promotion of the hesychastic tradition came to give an ascetical ideal par excellence for Orthodox prayer life. Even today there are numerous saints, both Athonite and non-Athonite, that have tasted the fruits of such a prayer life, experiencing God's energies as well as it is possible for the human being. We can't experience them completely. And to another topic. If Mount Athos has been an example of pure prayer life for more than a millennium, the Holy Mountain has been a home base for monasticism also in more practical aspects. It must be noted that at least from the beginning of the second millennium, Mount Athos acquired an ecumenical, in the sense of universal, aspect to it. There were monks from many places struggling on the peninsula, most importantly Serbs, Russians, and Georgians. These monks, in their turn, supported monasticism in their home countries. The Serbian monastery, Hilandari, became the most important center for Serbian monasticism in the whole world, and the role of the Georgian monastery, Iviron, was crucial for the flourishing of the Georgian Orthodox culture in the beginning of the second millennium. And I would like to emphasize that this is one of the most important tasks of the Holy Mountain even today. In Byzantium, there were other significant monastic communities as well, such as the Studium monastery in Constantinople, or the different monastic communities in Palestine, Syria, and the Sinai. But historical conditions have favored the Holy Mountain, especially from the 13th century onwards. During the different difficulties that monastic communities around the world have experienced under communist rule, or in mainland Greece under the Bavarian royal family, or even in the Russian Empire, Mount Athos has managed to preserve many different forms of Orthodox monasticism, despite the different periods of decay caused by pirate or Ottoman attacks or the Crusaders. Ever since the Middle Ages, there have been monks who have departed from the Holy Mountain to their old home countries or new and unknown territories to found monasteries that follow the Athonite rule. In my country of origin, Finland, there are two monasteries that, at least according to tradition, have been founded by Athonite monks, the monasteries of Konevets and Palamas. Now they are geographically located in Russia, but the old brotherhoods are in Finland. Here in North America, you have experienced such a phenomenon in the last few decades when Elder Ephraim, the former abbot of the Athonite monastery of Philokalia, has founded around 20 monasteries following the rule of his previous monastery in the Holy Mountain. Today, the Holy Mountain represents monasticism in its various forms. There one can find traditional Cenobitic monasticism, where everything is shared between the brotherhood. The abbot is the head of the brotherhood, and in most cases, all the monks also have the abbot as their father confessor. The abbot is elected by the brotherhood, and in usual cases is always a monk of the same brotherhood before being elected. But earlier in the 20th century, there were cases where abbots were brought from somewhere else, but this was an exceptional practice due to the lack of suitable candidates among the scarce brotherhoods. This practice of the abbot receiving his mandate from the brotherhood is unfortunately violated in many other Orthodox churches, for example in the Patriarchate of Moscow, where it is the bishops who appoint abbots and abbesses to monasteries. In such a practice, a true spiritual bond between the community and its leader cannot be established. Then in the Holy Mountain there are skeets. There are two kinds of them, Cenobitic and Idiorhythmic. This is an Idiorhythmic skeet. The Cenobitic skeets do not differ from a Cenobitic monastery in any other way in the Holy Mountain than their administrative dependency on one of the main monasteries. So it's usually an independent small monastery. Such is the Romanian skeet of St. John the Forerunner, for example. But the Idiorhythmic skeets, as you can see from the picture, consist of independent cells or houses that all have their own program and own spiritual autonomy. A cell may include only one monk, but the largest cells may have 10 monks, tens of monks, or dozens of monks. Such is the cell of Burazeri, for example, that belongs to the Serbian monastery of Hirandare. I think they have around 30 monks now, but it's called a cell. There are also remote hermitages, as you can see in the picture, and caves where there are hermits living in seclusion and very little contact with the outside world. So the Holy Mountain is one of the few places that has preserved these three forms of traditional Orthodox monasticism as they were extant in history too. And therefore, an aspirant monk even today can choose his lifestyle from all of these. Obedience in a Cenobitic community, more quiet life in the direction of an elder, or complete hermit life. It sometimes happens too that a monk might change his lifestyle during his years of ascetic struggle, even though this is usually not very much encouraged. The Idiorhythmic lifestyle has its dangers, however. During the difficult years of the Turkish yoke, as you know, Greece fell under the Turkish rule gradually during the 14th and 15th centuries, and so did the Holy Mountain. Many of the monasteries became Idiorhythmic because of the difficult situation. So inside the monastery there was no longer an abbot who was in charge of all the monks, but all the monks had their own finances, and sometimes they gathered together to the church to pray, but there was no central government in the monastery. Many of the older principles in this process became almost extinct. But let us jump ahead in history a couple of centuries from Saint Gregory Palamas in the 14th century to the late 18th century. In 1775, a man called Nicholas entered the monastery of Dionysio in the Holy Mountain, and in the tonsure he received the name Nicodemus, and now he is known as Saint Nicodemus the Hagiorite, or the Athonite. At that time, there was a spiritual movement in the Holy Mountain called Collybadis. The name of this movement derives from memorial wheat, Kolliba, as you might know. And the reason for this perhaps weird-sounding etymology is in the building process of a new church in the skeets of St. Anne in the Holy Mountain, which was built in the late 18th century. In order to collect money for the new church, memorial services were conducted even on Sundays, because people usually gave some money for the memorial services. But traditionally the church forbids memorial services on Sundays. And there was a group of monks that represented the hesychastic tradition that had still existed to some extent in the Holy Mountain. And they yielded after doing the memorial services not on Sundays, but on Saturdays, which is the ancient tradition of the church. And this controversy led to a patriarchal intervention, and no consensus was eventually reached. But the Collybadis were not considered only with it was not a question only related to the memorial services, because in general the Collybadis wanted to return to a Eucharistic-centered spirituality, and they emphasized frequent communion because it had become a habit to receive communion maybe once a year in most of the monasteries. And finally, in 1819, this Collybadis controversy that had gone for half a century, a council at the Patriarchate supported the Collybadis movement. Saint Nicodemus, who you see here, was perhaps one of the most famous of the Collybadis, even though he was not yet around when the first disputes took place. Saint Nicodemus was a prolific author. He traveled around the Athonite monasteries and got acquainted with the libraries and their manuscripts, some of which had been neglected for centuries. One must remember that at this time, because of the Ottoman rule in Greece, there was very little editorial work in the libraries because the Ottomans didn't allow printing. So all the Greek patristic texts, for example, that were printed after the 15th century were printed in the West, most often in Venice or in Vienna, where they had Greek presses. And most of the patristic texts published in these first centuries after printing became possible were published by Roman Catholics. So, for example, a church father like Gregory Palamas was never published by the Roman Catholics because he was not a Catholic saint. Saint Nicodemus traveled around the libraries of the Holy Mountain and edited patristic texts, including also a complete edition of the text of Saint Gregory Palamas. But this edition was destroyed in a fire at the printing house in Vienna before it was printed. The story tells that the fire was commissioned by Ottomans and that Saint Nicodemus suffered 6 months from depression after hearing that the only manuscript edition that he had written in his own hand had been destroyed. And it was actually only around 200 years later when the next edition of the works of Saint Gregory Palamas was published. So it was a true loss. Saint Nicodemus also collected information on Athonite saints, so we have to thank him for having an almost full record of all the Athonite saints who have existed throughout the centuries. Unfortunately, in my own monastery, the monks didn't let him enter the library, so we don't have from our monastery any systematic collection of the names of the saints. Saint Nicodemus also wrote a commentary on canon law called the Rudder, which is perhaps the most influential commentary on the canons. Even today, it's been translated to English too, so you might have read it. But regarding spirituality, the most famous of Saint Nicodemus's works was an anthology of spiritual treatises called Philokalia, and it is a piece of work he compiled together with his friend from youth, Saint Macarius of Corinth. During his expeditions in the different Athonite libraries, Saint Nicodemus collected ascetical works to support the spirituality of the Collybadis. So the whole compilation of the Philokalia derives from this Collybadis movement. The collection includes texts from Saint Anthony the Great all the way up to Saint Gregory Palamas, even though the works of Saint Anthony are actually spurious. They're not written by Saint Anthony himself, but Saint Nicodemus didn't know this. You can find valuable studies on the Philokalian tradition in English by Metropolitan Callistus Ware, for example, and this is also his translation. And the name of the collection is stolen from a patristic source, the Anthology of Origen's Teachings, compiled by Basil the Great and Gregory of Nazianzus in the 4th century. The actual title of the book is The Philokalia of the Neptic Fathers. The notion of nepsis, often translated as watchfulness or sobriety, is the main theme of the book. It's how to achieve sobriety during prayer. The texts are mainly concentrated on quiet prayer life and especially the use of the Jesus prayer, so it's a kind of continuation of the Hesychast tradition. Additionally, there are many texts on practical aspects of monastic life, including obedience and fasting, and treatises on mystical theology, most notably the 400 chapters on love by Maximus the Confessor and Gregory Palamas' theological treatises. The Philokalia reached an important position, especially in Russian spirituality, even beyond monasticism, and therefore it's a very important Athonite contribution to Orthodox spirituality from the 18th century onwards. In Greece, it actually never gained such a reputation that it gained in Russia. In Greece, it still remains very much a monastic work, not so much for lay people. And in Greece, it's impossible to find the original Greek printed and sold. It's been sold out for decades. Another ascetic as active in the late 18th century, a contemporary of Saint Nicodemus, called Saint Paisie Velichkovsky, did a translation of the Philokalia into Slavonic, and it's called Dobrotolubia, which has the same etymology, love towards good or beauty. Saint Paisie was a Ukrainian-born monk who lived first as a monk both in Ukraine and Moldavia, but seeking after a more complete devotion to God, he arrived to the Holy Mountain, around the same time with Saint Nicodemus. He had both Romanian and Slavonic disciples, and simultaneously with Saint Nicodemus, he started conducting manuscript studies on the patristic texts preserved in the Athonite libraries. He translated into Church Slavonic a significant number of also other Greek patristic texts, apart from the Philokalia. And after 17 years in the Holy Mountain, he was summoned back to Moldavia, where he returned together with his brotherhood, in order to both continue the translation work of the Greek fathers and to provide an Athonite example for monastic life in the Romanian church. One of his disciples, Raphael, was also active in translating some of the patristic texts compiled by Saint Paisie into Romanian. Saint Paisie was therefore an important bridge between Athonite, Slavonic, and Romanian Orthodoxy. In addition to the immense influence of the Dobrotolubia had on Russian spirituality, many of his disciples founded monasteries in Russia, emphasizing the Hesychast tradition. His spiritual influence can be seen even in the Optina monastery and in the life of Saint Seraphim of Sarov. So much of this Russian spirituality from 18th century onwards was also due to the Holy Mountain. The Philokalia and the Jesus Prayer has in the 20th century become influential also outside of Orthodoxy. It has become a popular form of spirituality in the Roman Catholic Church and also among some Protestant groups. Earlier on, I mentioned that the Holy Mountain has provided a practical example of monasticism for monasteries throughout the world. Especially the Collybadis movement and Saint Nicodemus' legacy plays an important role here. The reintroduction of traditional monastic customs has since the late 18th century been very much centered on the Holy Mountain. I provide here a practical example of one of these traditional customs that have been reintroduced into the Greek, especially Athonite tradition. And this aspect is the reintroduction of the office of the Great and Angelic Schema as the standard tonsure for monks. In most Athonite monasteries, the passage to the monastic order nowadays consists of 3 parts. When one is a novice, there is a service called rasophoria, or the wearing of garments. In this, the monk is simply vested with the monastic vestments, but there are no prayers. This is only a phase of the novitiate, and the candidate is not considered a full monk yet. The second phase of monasticism is called rasoevchi, or the prayer of the cassock, where the candidate is again vested in the monastic clothing, but this time also including the cowl. There are some prayers included in the ceremony, as well as a tonsure where hair is cut, and the monk's name is usually changed in this process. Despite the fact that there are no vows included in this level of monasticism, it is commonly thought that the monk implicitly commits to all monastic principles and will not leave the monastery anymore. Depending on the monastery and the discernment of the abbot, the last and final phase of monasticism is the Great and Angelic Schema. You can see the red embroidered cloth is the Great Schema. It is usually granted to monks after perhaps a decade or two after they began their monastic struggles. In this ceremony, the final vows are given, and which are now explicit, and the monk begins to wear the analavon, or the schema, and the polystavrion, a garment made of strings in the shape of the cross on the top of the clothing. You can see it here, for example. This is the polystavrion. They both symbolize the light yoke of Christ that we carry when we become monks. In the history, and even today in the Russian tradition, it had become more common to grant the Great Schema only to few monks before they die. And it was more common to grant only the so-called small schema to most of the monks. And this is, as I said, the current practice in many non-Greek churches. And Saint Nicodemus criticized this practice very much in his times. His argumentation on this was based on patristic sources, including Saint Theodore the Studite, who already in his time in the 9th century criticized the practice of doing the small schema at all. Saint Nicodemus writes, "So then, what kind of ignorance is this when small schema monks are required to keep the strict lifestyle and perform the works of the great schema monk through the vows they make to God, and then not to become great schema monks? Are they merely to endure such labors and be deprived of that grace? Are they to grow old in their monastic life, never having become monks? Are they to fight this arena and in the struggle and then be unworthy to receive the crown? Is there any greater harm to be found than this? Or is there anything more ridiculous than for someone to pass 35 years as a small schema monk, and then, when about to receive the great schema, for him to be asked, 'Why have you come, brother?' And then for him to reply, 'Out of desire for the ascetical life, honorable father.' That is, for him to be dressed as a layman, to be questioned as a layman, and for him to reply as a layman, after being in the monastery for 35 years. Therefore, it is more exact and more correct and better for monks to become great schema monks one time, without first becoming small schema monks, even if the authorities do this." So he was kind of an anarchist. Once, because by this one and only time the schema of monks is shown in fact to be one in singular, just as the tradition of the Holy Fathers intends. And also because when the young and healthy receive the schema, they are to cultivate the grace they received and multiply and increase the talent of their Lord, namely the spiritual strength which the divine schema mystically granted to the soul, through struggles against the demons, through conquering the passions, and through the charismata which they will receive from the Holy Spirit. So after St. Nicodemus' time, it became customary in the Holy Mountain to tonsure all of the monks to the great schema. And the practice of doing the small schema gradually disappeared. There might be some monasteries still today that do the small schema first and then the great schema. And again, the Athonites' practice has been a model for other monastic communities. Now it has become customary in many Balkan monasteries, including several post-Yugoslavian countries, influenced by the Holy Mountain, to grant the great schema to all of the monks after a reasonable amount of years at the monastery. The imitation of Athonite practice is done also in a more wholesome way. Many Greek and non-Greek monasteries have adopted Athonite typika that dictate both rubrics for the divine services, but also the everyday life of the monks, when to eat, when to sleep, etc. In many monasteries, the presence of pilgrims resulted in revisiting the monastery schedule to accommodate the needs of lay people outside of the Holy Mountain, while in the Holy Mountain we stick to the Byzantine time. We schedule services and meals according to the sunset, not according to the pilgrim schedules. Therefore, we start our morning office, including midnight office, Orthodox hours and liturgy, between 2 and 4 a.m. at our monastery, depending on the time of the year, and this is preceded by a personal prayer rule. This ancient practice of praying at night has been embraced by many monastic dwellings abroad and in non-Greek traditions as well, because in some monasteries they started doing services at 5 p.m. and 9 a.m. to accommodate to the pilgrims. Elder Emilianos, who was the abbot of the monastery of Simonopetra, summarized the practice and benefits of praying at night in the following way. Rise up at night, pray in front of God so that he would see you. In other words, you should stand there so that he can examine you. In this way you will achieve the vision of God. Your prayer, standing aright in front of God, is also about you beholding him. It is your mystical experience in the Lord's light. You should, however, be rested at this time so that you can feel and see. The night is the time for spiritual achievements and the time for sowing and harvest. Before coming to the end of my talk, let me talk a little of the 20th century. So we have now these 4 points of history that we've talked about: St. Peter in the 9th century, and St. Gregory the Palamas in the 14th, St. Nicodemus in the 18th, and now the 20th century. This century in general was not the best one for Orthodoxy. At the beginning of the century, there were as many as 7,000 monks on the Athonite Peninsula, half of them Russian. Finally, in 1913, Greece claimed the peninsula from the Ottoman Empire. But at the same time, there was an internal crisis in the Holy Mountain. a heresy called Imyaslavia in Slavonic, because most of the monks were Russians at that time, sometimes called onomatodoxy in English, I think, claimed that the name of God is God himself. This kind of emerged from the Hesychast tradition because they used the Jesus prayer. So there was a monk in Russia who wrote a book called something about the Caucasus. I don't remember the title of the book. And he claimed that the name of God is God himself. There were many monks in the Holy Mountain who started supporting this idea, and Russia sent the Archbishop of Vologda to deal with the crisis, but he failed to find a diplomatic solution. And as a result, the Imyaslavci were exiled from the Holy Mountain in the early 20th century. So they lost a big part of the population. Then the World Wars came. Most of Orthodox countries fell under communist rule. Their borders were closed, which prevented new monks from coming to the Holy Mountain. Moreover, Greece, to which the Holy Mountain now belonged, here are, by the way, some Russian officials and monks from the early 20th century. Greece suffered from Nazi occupation. Fortunately enough, Hitler set the Holy Mountain under his personal protection, and the peninsula remained almost untouched by the German occupation of Greece. Hitler did, however, have plans of confiscating the treasures of the monasteries and bring them with him to Germany. A group of German scholars arrived to catalogue the treasures, but the occupation ended before the plan was realized. This was followed by the Greek Civil War and other political restlessness during the mid-century. In this situation, many of the monasteries fell into decline, and some of the Russian settlements, such as the Skeet of St. Andrew, became empty, and many of their treasures were stolen during the decades because there was nobody to guard them. As a result of all of this, in the early 20th century, as I said, there were 7,000 monks in the Holy Mountain. In 1963, they celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the Holy Mountain, which was basically the 1000th anniversary of the foundation of the Great Lavra. There were only 1,000 monks left, and the atmosphere reminded more of a funeral than of a blooming monastic center. But there were monks in the desert who practiced hesychastic lifestyle, even in this time of decay. One of the most important persons at that time was Elder Joseph the Hesychast. Sorry, the picture is of bad quality, I couldn't find a better picture. Whose disciples became later abbots or spiritual fathers of several Athonite monasteries. So this one small brotherhood in the desert reoccupied many of the monasteries. Elder Ephraim of Arizona is one of these monks, the last one of the brotherhood still alive. Elder Ephraim is the second from the left. A lot of young monks arrived and aspired to revive traditional monasticism in the Holy Mountain. In the 1970s, the monastic community of Meteora in central Greece also played an important role in reviving some of the monasteries. The fathers of the Simonopetra monastery, which is nowadays one of the most dynamic monastic communities in the Holy Mountain, arrived in the 70s together with their abbot Elder Emilianos in the left. And a few years later, our abbot, Archimandrite Alexius on the right, still our abbot today, arrived from Meteora with a group of fathers to occupy, not in a violent way, the Xenophontos monastery. Later on, a part of our brotherhood was sent to reoccupy the fading Pantokratoros monastery in the early 90s. So 3 of the monasteries are reorganized by fathers from Meteora in central Greece. What was characteristic for these young brotherhoods, these new brotherhoods, was their zeal for the renovation of monastic ideals and also the buildings that had fallen into a lousy state. The fresh approach to Cenobitic monasticism in the Holy Mountain played and still plays a significant role in the reviving of monastic communities both in Greece and abroad, as I said. But there are also cultural aspects to it that have become increasingly important in the Orthodox world. One of these was the revival of Byzantine chant. In the Greek kingdom, thanks to the Bavarian influence of the royal family, especially in Athens, Byzantine chant fell into decline and polyphonic arrangements, sometimes even accompanied with instruments, such as the church organ, were preferred. And in North America, you can see the fruits of this in many Greek churches even today, where they still continue using instruments and polyphonic singing. In the Holy Mountain, on the other hand, there were still virtuoso chanters in the 20th century who had preserved much of the old oral traditions. Here you can see one of the most famous, two of the most famous chanting brotherhoods from mid-20th century onwards. The Danielei is Elder Daniel, and next to him, Elder Thomas, who passed away last year. With the arrival of these new Cenobitic monastic communities from Meteora, especially the Brotherhood of Simonopetra, the choral style of singing was revived that had practically disappeared from Greece. Even though, especially the Simonopetra's chanting style has not only revived old, but also created new compositions and musical styles that do not comply with previously existing traditions. So there's also a creation of something new. Lately, there has also been some attempts to record Athonite chanting style, because there's also an Athonite school of chanting, in a written form, and there is a significant collection of recordings done by some Greek musicologists and the Vatoperi Brotherhood of the greatest chanters of the Holy Mountain in the 20th century. Also, because of the mod cons of today, including quick transportation, today Athonite monks are a common sight in many Greek parishes, but also abroad. They have become public speakers, father confessors, and spiritual guides for tens or hundreds or thousands of people around the world. It seems to me that yet again the Holy Mountain is a lighthouse of Orthodoxy that shines to all the world, both attracting young men from all society classes, peasants and professors, and places of all the world, Australia, America, Finland, and Africa, but also doing an outreach that has not been experienced ever before in world history. One important form of this mission in the church is the visits different Athonite monasteries do with their relics. The monasteries have a rich collection of relics. For example, in our monastery we have parts of the right hand of St. George, our patron saint, the hand of St. Marina, the skull of St. Panteleimon, the skull of St. Stephen the Protodeacon, etc. And they are often taken out to parish visits so that everyone would have the possibility to venerate them. On these occasions, the relics are also often taken to hospitals to heal people. They bring both spiritual and physical healing and the blessing of the Mother of God with them. Despite this exploitation of modern technology, the Holy Mountain also carries a different message in today's world, which is full of rapid changes. For the 1000th anniversary in 1963, the first road of the Holy Mountain was built, but it met a lot of opposition from some of the representatives of the Holy Community. After this, a couple of other roads have been built. Many of the monasteries still use generators or solar panels for creating electricity. There are no electricity lines in the Holy Mountains. Internet and phone networks have made their way to the Athonite Peninsula. But despite these modern developments, the monks stick to their old lifestyle. The Holy Mountain announces a message of stability to all the world. Even with the technological developments, many monasteries, including my own, practice a strict policy of not allowing the majority of the monks to have access to mobile phones, internet, or computers. Only the ones who necessarily need these for their obedience tasks at the monastery have them. And especially our abbot warns us often against the dangers of social media. This is a message that should be heard throughout the world. Technology has its advantages, but especially the social media and smartphones have created serious problems for our mental and physical health. Another Athonite scholar, Father Maximus of Simonopetra, stated in a talk on modern technology and Orthodox spirituality that distraction is the original sin of the mind. It is no surprise that the Athonites opposed to this new technology, not because they would per se be against modern developments, but because the hesychastic tradition has prevailed for so long on this peninsula. The whole aim of hesychasm is to gain control of the mind, keep it undistracted, as Evagrios of Pontus states in his chapters on prayer in the Philokalia. Evagrios says, prayer is a communion of the mind with God. What sort of state does the mind need so that it can reach out to its Lord without turning back and commune with him without intermediary? Strive to have your mind stand deaf and dumb at the time of prayer, and you will be able to pray. In Greece, the Holy Community of the Holy Mountain also plays a significant political role. During the reign of the Syriza party, which is the major party at the moment in Greece, a lot of law changes that challenge traditional Orthodox values that were long cherished in Greece have been introduced. As an answer to this, the Holy Mountain has given declarations against the promotion of postmodern subjectivism and secularism in the Greek society. Unfortunately, that has not always resulted in the abandonment of such laws, but their public presence has been visible and audible. So the Holy Mountain is a very audible voice in the Greek society. The same applies to dogmatic and spiritual questions that are discussed today. The Holy Mountain has always safeguarded true orthodoxy, and the most recent example of this was the Athonite representation in the Great and Holy Synod in Crete 2 years ago as a part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Unfortunately, there's also a group called Zealots in the Holy Mountain who refuse to commemorate the Ecumenical Patriarch, the Bishop of the Peninsula, and to share mysteries with the monks that are in communion with new calendar bishops. The monastery of Esvigmenu is illegally occupied by such monks, as are some parts of the Skedes in the southern end of the peninsula. However, the holy community has rightly taken a strict attitude towards these deviations from Orthodox traditions and has supported the Holy Mountain's faithfulness to the aspirations of the Ecumenical Patriarchate for a united Orthodoxy. And the very last aspect of Athonite spirituality I want to bring up in my talk is one of the most important things the Holy Mountain has offered to the whole world in the 20th century. I'm speaking of the true great saints of our times, Saint Paisios and Saint Porphyrios. Today is actually Saint Paisios' feast day. They were contemporaries but had very different lives. Saint Paisios was a refugee boy from Asia Minor born in 1924, and he was baptized by Saint Arsenios of Cappadocia. After a blessed childhood and taking part in the civil war in Greece, he wanted to become a monk. He looked for many spiritual teachers and had difficulties in finding them. In the 60s, he also spent a few years in Mount Sinai, and later during this decade, he acquired close relations with the sisterhood of the monastery of Saint John the Theologian in Suroti near Thessaloniki in northern Greece. Saint Paisios, being both an Athonite monk and a spiritual guide of the Suroti monastery, was a tireless spiritual guide to thousands of people. He gave advice in a language that was easily understood and easily approachable to everyone. The sisters of the Suroti monastery have collected his spiritual guidance to a series of volumes that have also been translated into English. Saint Paisios thus is one of the most revered saints of our times. His grave in Suroti collects hundreds of thousands of pilgrims every year, and miracles happen there. In many of his teachings, he prefers modern metaphors, such as in this following saying: "What gas is to a machine, so is the heart to the spiritual life. Whenever man does something from the heart, he is not exhausted by it. For this reason, whenever people ask me what they should study, I tell them instead what they should love. In particular, certain professions like doctor and teacher require that those doing them love the work a lot. This is the same in the spiritual life. The heart must participate in prayer." Another aspect that was common for these two saints, Paisios and Porphyrios, was the use of humor. Saint Paisios, clairvoyant as he was, saw in his spirit once that some young men were on their way to meet him, but not with the best of intentions. They just wanted to see this man everybody was talking about. Saint Paisios left his cell before the boys came and left a sign on the front entrance saying, "Zoo, the monkey is away." Saint Porphyrios, on the other hand, entered the Holy Mountain as a small child, only 12 years old, and he was strictly trained to the monastic lifestyle by two elders. However, due to health issues, he had to leave the Holy Mountain when he was still young, and eventually he became a hospital priest in Athens. He ended up founding a female monastery in Milesi, but the most impressive place for the spiritual guidance he provided was a small caravan in which he lived. For the last decade of his life, he returned back to the Holy Mountain. Saint Porphyrios had received a lot of gifts of the Spirit. He was clairvoyant, as was Saint Paisios, which helped him to deal with people from many different society classes, including hippies, as some of the stories told. Like Saint Paisios, Saint Porphyrios was particularly concerned about the changing conditions of family life in Greece in his times, including the rapid increase in divorces. Saint Porphyrios teaches, "The life of the parents is the only thing that makes good children. Parents should be very patient and saint-like to their children. They should truly love their children, and the children will share this love. For the bad attitude of the children," says Father Porphyrios, "the ones who are usually responsible for it are their parents themselves. The parents don't help their children by lecturing them and repeating to them advices, or by making them obeying strict rules in order to impose discipline. If the parents do not become saints and truly love their children, and if they don't struggle for it, then they make a huge mistake. With their wrong and or negative attitude, the parents convey to their children their negative feelings. Then their children become reactive and insecure, not only to their home, but to the society as well. Saint Porphyrios was also known for his utterly positivity. He saw everything in the light of Christ. He said, "This is the way we should see Christ. He is our friend, our brother. He is whatever is good and beautiful. He is everything. Yet he is still a friend, and he shouts it out. 'You're my friends, don't you understand that? We are brothers. I don't hold hell in my hands. I'm not threatening you. I love you. I want you to enjoy life together with me.'" Apart from these two recently canonized saints, there are many other elders in the 20th century who have spread out the message of Athonite spirituality. Another contemporary of Paisios and Porphyrios, Elder Ephraim of Katunakia, not of Arizona, of Katunakia, was a fervent speaker for obedience, and his spiritual teachings are now being distributed, both in Greek and other languages. His influence was strong everywhere in the Holy Mountain, even in our monastery where he often visited. Another yet to be canonized saint was Elder Sophrony Sakharov, who was a disciple of the renowned Athonite saint Siluan at the Russian monastery of St. Panteleimon. And as you probably know, Elder Sophrony founded a famous double monastery in Essex, England, that carries his spiritual legacy forward even today. I apologize if the sporadicness of my talk has tired you today, but the history and spiritual legacy of the Holy Mountain, as I said, is difficult to be contained in such a short presentation. We have dealt with many topics ranging from the very early history of the Holy Mountain to contemporary aspects, from valuable material treasures to invaluable spiritual treasures. The Holy Mountain is indeed both a cultural and spiritual center. It provides something for everybody. But after years of monastic life on the peninsula, and especially working in the guest house of our monastery, which is my obedience task, I can assure you that no one leaves Mount Athos without a visible change in them. Even if one's intentions would not have been sincere, there is so much holiness around that it necessarily affects everyone. Some are shocked, some are moved, some feel repentance, some joy, some awe, but everybody feels something. The Theotokos has not left her garden, but continues to protect her sons even today. That's it for my words. If you have any comments or questions, I'll be happy to.